So this bit of teaching that I want to do is going to explore Martha Stark's modes of therapeutic action. There's this wonderful book, which some of you may be aware of, that Martha has written. It's not a cheap book, but it's an excellent, excellent book about the way we might conceptualize the way we hold different ways of working when we're being a therapist. And I want to talk us through those so that we've got some framework together to explore the therapeutic relationship. So I'm going to put a slide up on my screen where I've taken some of the key points that Martha Stark makes, and I'm going to talk those points through with you all. There's two sources written at the bottom of this slide. One is Martha Stark's book, which I just showed to you. The second is a critique of her opening chapters by a body psychotherapist called Michael Soth, which you can find if you just do a search online. He's made that publicly available. And his document is called A Summary of the Introductory Chapter to the book, Martha Stark's book, with a commentary and critique by Michael Soth. You may have come across this before in the training, so for some of you this might feel like a review, but I think it's a really important thing to review because this idea of a one-person psychology, a one-and-a-half-person psychology, or a two-person psychology, we use this frame a lot within transactional analysis. It gets talked about. And I don't know if we always talk about the origins of it, which is why I wanted to share Martha Stark's thinking. So Martha Stark, in her book, identifies that as psychology has developed since Freud's time, there has been a movement from treating people and treating patients and thinking about people, clients, patients, one another, as having internal conflicts. Moving from thinking that people have internal conflicts to thinking that people have grown into adults with structural deficits, with things that they missed from their upbringing. So the first model that Martha Stark talked about and identifies is one where we might think about people having internal conflicts. The second model is where we might think about people having needs that haven't been met. And then the third model, Martha Stark identifies that psychological thinking has moved on, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, to think that the therapeutic relationship itself and engaging within the relationship as two authentic individuals, that in of itself brings about psychological growth. And she and other thinkers, and Martha Stark didn't come up with the idea of the one person, one and a half, two person, but she has popularized it. She identifies this way of thinking about the extent to which the therapist is in the foreground to the relationship or not. So if I look at model one first, model one, which is the name she gives to this group, Martha Stark identifies that for many years, from Freud up until the 50s, perhaps the 40s and 50s, psychological thinking was very much featured and focused on internal structural issues, and that the therapist doesn't see herself as a participant in the therapy relationship, but styles themselves as an objective observer of the client or the patient, and that the purpose of the therapy is to enhance knowledge. It's an analytic process. The therapist isn't thinking about who they've become in the client's story. They're simply thinking about their observations, their analysis of the client, and what structural issues they may be experiencing. If you think about the way we've learned to think about classical transactional analysis, and analyzing ego states, analyzing games, analyzing transactions, that is quite typical, or that style is quite typical of this one-person model. The goal of therapy in this model is, in the short term, enhancement of knowledge, and the ultimate goal is the resolution of structural conflict. So I might think about that in terms of decontamination of ego states. I think, and I've added this bit at the bottom here about TA, schools of TA. I think both the classical school of TA and the redecision school very much approach their work in this way. The second model that she identifies is one that arose in the 40s and 50s and 60s, recognizing that it was our upbringings, the nurture part of nature and nurture, that means that as we grow into adults, we have deficiencies within us, that we have things that we still need, and that the therapist can play a role in providing those things. So in this 1.5 person model, the half is that the therapist is half present. The therapist is providing a reparative experience. But it doesn't really matter about the identity of the therapist's own self. What is more important, if we think within this model, is the provision of the experience that the therapist offers, the nurturing experience, or the attunement, the experience of recognition that they offer to their client, and that in that the therapist becomes a good object that can be introjected by the client. We might talk about this from within TA, that the therapist becomes someone that is introjected into the parent ego state, and that the therapist and client have experiences that are taken into the client's child ego state, which repair or meet a deficit. So the therapist's main purpose is to provide an experience for the client. It's a reparative relationship, and that the goal is providing a corrective experience that ultimately fills in that structural deficit. So we might think about the cathexis school of transactional analysis, which advocated reparenting, that a therapist can become a new parental figure, and that integrative TA as a school is very strongly focused in its writings on the provision of a reparative experience. And then in the last 20 years, in the last 30 years, psychological thinking evolves again. And writers, thinkers, practitioners begin to think about another model, a model where the patient, the client, and the therapist together co-create an experience, that together create a relationship in which, and within that relationship, both parties have a subjectivity, which is why this is called a 2-person model. So the client's subjectivity and the therapist's subjectivity are both relevant. The aim of the relationship is an authenticity, being authentic with one another and examining the edge, the intimate edge where two people meet. And the belief is that engagement in that relationship is in of itself therapeutic and beneficial, and creates a container in which therapist and client can examine transference and countertransference, that the therapist can potentially use their subjective experience, their countertransference, to inform the work. So the short-term goal is engaging in relationship, building and deepening a connection. And the ultimate goal is developing a capacity for healthy, authentic relatedness, supporting the client to relate in the moment and working through the ways in which they might reenact things with another person by the two of them being attentive to that process. We think of the relational school of transactional analysis. We think of the co-creative, constructivist schools of transactional analysis would very much, their thinking would fall within this 2-person approach, model 3 as Martha Stark describes it. And I want to share a slide with you with a little bit more of Martha Stark's thinking on. So Stark offers these 3 modes of therapeutic action: enhancement of knowledge, which is model 1, the provision of experience, model 2, and engagement in the relationship, model 3. And I love this sentence. I want to share this sentence with you. She writes, if the therapist is to be optimally effective, then she must be able to work comfortably within all 3 modes of therapeutic action, sometimes first using one and then another. And this is the important bit for me, sometimes using 2 or 3 approaches simultaneously. And I share this with you as a challenge, and we'll talk more about this, because I think in our transactional analysis literature, when people write about a 2-person psychology and a relational approach, it might not necessarily be understood that we can take that approach, that model 3 approach, engagement in relationship, whilst also engaging in a provision of experience and also enhancing knowledge, that we might be able to use a 1-person, a 1.5-person, and a 2-person style simultaneously. And then we'll be thinking about that as we think more about ruptures and repairs. But Stark says one more thing, which is that, as she says, that the most effective listening stance is an optimal balance between the listening positions that fit each of those 3 modes. One is of being a neutral object. One is being an empathic self-object, an empathic object for the client. And the third is being an authentic subject. And that there is a place for all 3 ways to listen to your client at the same time.